A theme song for the Get Podcast. A little bit different this week. Welcome, everybody. My name's Troy.
My name's Leon, and we have our second guest on the podcast ever. Ladies and gentlemen, John Browne.
G'day, John. How you going,
how's
mate?
it going?
Good. Thank you for
fine. How are you?
Good. Thank you for being here. And as Leon said, you're John Browne, not that John Browne, the other John Browne.
The other John Browne, yes. Yep. That name was taken by somebody who's actually good at guitar, so I was stuck with that.
Tell us a little bit about where you're calling in from, time of the day, what you like to do with your time on this earth.
Well, it's 8 a.m. at the moment in Germany, where I live at the moment, or where I've been living for most of my life. And yes, I'm an engineer, a mechanical engineer, an automotive engineer by trade. I used to be a test engineer, and I'm very passionate about all things guitar. It's been my longest passion, whether it's guitars, pickups, amps. I'm working my way down the signal chain, and last thing, I was stuck on speakers and very obsessed with and probably still obsessed with the vintage 30. And
this is going to be such a good chat. I can't wait.
It's going to be great because Troy's been going down the speaker rabbit hole. We've already done one podcast about speakers, but for the uninitiated, you put out a video recently, which pretty much everyone I know who's into ultimate guitar nerd fandom, which we all are, was talking about it. And it was like a Herculean task, what you did in that. And it brings us to the topic straight in about, the Celestion Vintage 30. And for as long as I've been reading about guitar gear and listening to things about guitar gear, it's been in the conversation as a kind of polarized, like it's a strange thing because it's sort of like a polarizing choice, yet it's also a standard choice as well. So I figured, before we dive into the nitty gritty, because I'm sure it might feel like torture for you, you've already done an entire video about it. I'll start with my experiences about vintage 30s. We'll just sort of go around about, when you encountered the idea that this thing even existed. And it brings me to Troy, because I remember growing up playing Marshalls and having Marshall cabs and just only ever playing T75s and thinking, well, that's a 4x12 cab. It's 300 watts. More watts is better. That's what you wanted. And Troy, you had like a Marshall 1960 BV he was playing with.
Yep.
And, it was like less watts and, kind of thinking, why would this guy do this? But also realizing, his cabinet had a totally different sound to mine. And I was just like, well, I got a slanted one. He's got a straight one. It's obviously that. And that was basically my introduction to it. And then I just read things on forums about it's the only speaker you need, or don't ever touch this speaker because it's trash. And, all the cliches about, this particular year or this particular manufacturer are better, whatever better means. So, I'm sure anyone interested in this podcast has read all those kind of things, but it's it's kind of still a hot topic when it comes to guitar speakers. So yeah, I remember getting turned on to them and then having that realization of like, maybe this is something that I want, and it becoming, the thing for me for a while. So,
and I think for me, I have that Marshall 4x12 because I've said this on the podcast before, but I got it on eBay with an 80A MP1 for about 600 Australian dollars back. This is over almost 20 years ago now. Not for any other reason other than I wanted an 80A MP1 and someone was selling one locally with a cabinet. So that's the cabinet that I had. It's approximately 2003, 2004. And it just had the V30s in it. And then that was that. And, played with that. And then I got an orange 1x12 in about 2010. Also had a vintage 30 in it. And I was like, well, and around that time, it's like, oh, cool. Vintage 30s are the best. That's basically all I knew. And everything else is trash. And I was also confused as to why it was a 280 watt cab, even though it says vintage 30 on it, because that didn't really make sense to my mathematical brain. But yeah, it's funny because I'll say too, I haven't watched your video because knowing that you were coming on, I kind of want to get a bit of a picture from you straight away. And like maybe we can go through it, and also for other listeners that haven't watched your video. But I've been going through a bit of a hatred of V30s like in the last 6 months, which is really strange because I used to love them so much. but there's a few amps that I have that just don't seem to work with that speaker. And this is why I'm into speakers, because it's really set me off on this new path of like, you know, I need to kind of work out what head matches what speaker or cabinet, or if it's a 2x12 or it's a 1x12, all these sort of things. So when you get into that side of it, at least what I've noticed, it's just like physically just a pain in the ass, like having to change speakers out of cabinets and unscrew them and stuff. That's the part that I hate the most. I like experimenting with it, but it's different to just plugging a distortion pedal in and twisting some knobs or plugging a head in. It's like physically, like it's not that difficult, but it takes like another 5 minutes to do, and I hate that.
Especially, I see an orange cab in the back of your room there.
Yep.
Those backplates on the orange cabs are stuck on like crazy. I have a 4x12 and a 2x12, and on both of them, to change the speakers, I not only have to unscrew the back panel, I have to take off the speaker terminal to reach in there to actually pull those things off. They're so tight.
Oh, I'll say
that's annoying.
That cab I actually haven't changed anything in. That's not my cab, but I've had it because a friend of the show, Jay, that belongs to him, and I had my orange 1x12. And he's like, man, I got this 212, it's too big. And I've got a 112, it's probably not big enough. So we just did a, not permanent swap, but a little just trade for now. But that thing, it's a open back it's got two V30s in it, runs at 16 ohms. That's basically as much info as I have on it. It sounds cool. You can't see it. This cab here, which is it's a little black 1x12.
Yeah.
It's a legacy brand. Like, I'm not sure if that is sold everywhere, but I think it's kind of like the Epiphone. Epiphone had those amps, the Valve Juniors and stuff. It's in the same. They look exactly the same. But I've got that cab, which is an MDF cab with a creamback in it, creamback H. And I dragged that out today to have a little bit of a play around.
It's another great speaker.
The speaker's awesome, but have a feeling that cabinet is maybe not the one, but that's maybe a topic for later on. So with all that being said, my V30 journey, Uncle Leon's V30 journey. So can you just tell me and tell everybody else, like, what's the deal? How did you get into this?
Well, my V30 journey starts, I think, a bit similar to that one of Leon's. We had, or my band at the time had a rehearsal space, and the two cabs, or one of the cabs that was in there was a Marshall 1960 cab, an A cab, slanted one. Mm-hmm. And the other guitarist had or probably still has, a PV60 505 Plus, and I had at the time, my only amp was the Laney Ironheart 60. And at rehearsals, I'd really have to crank the poor little Laney to compete sonically, and I never really thought that the guitar cab or the speakers would have anything to do with that. At that time, anyway, I was completely ignorant to that. I thought, cabs are cabs, speakers are speakers. They're all going to sound the same. I didn't know yet that, unlike hi-fi speakers, guitar speakers are actually designed to impart a specific or a certain characteristic to your tone. Mm-hmm. I didn't know any of this. And then one day in 2012 or 2013, this English band touring band came to our little town where we opened for them, support. The band was called Kai Deka. They don't exist anymore, sadly. But this guy had an orange 4x12. And basically, to save us a hassle of setting up, he asked if I wanted to use his cab for our opening show. And I said, yeah, sure, why not? And I never sounded better. I thought, holy shit, this is awesome. Yep. It is the speakers. It was an eye-opening moment for me. I thought, okay, good. I didn't think it was the cab back then, but the speakers. And
what? So the cab, it was a 1x12 or
it was a 4x12.
It was 4x12. Okay.
It was a 4x12 orange cab.
Oh no, your Laney one.
412.
Your Laney cabinet, was that a 1x12 or that was a 4x12?
No, I had a Laney Ironheart amp, and I was using that with the Marshall 1960.
Oh, that was with the 60. Okay, gotcha.
Cab that we had in the rehearsal space. That had the T75 speakers in that. People either tend to love or to hate, and
I love them.
Basically,
now,
then I decided, I'm kind of indifferent, which is silly because I just said you either love them or hate them.
That's
but
right.
I'm not sure yet. I'm on the fence.
That's okay.
So basically, then I decided I never want to play that cab again. I want to find something with V30s. And down in the depths, the crazy Russian guy that ran the rehearsal space had two vintage 30 cabs. One was a Hughes and Kettner, and one was an Engel cab that somebody had just left there years before and covered in this weird faux fur, kind of like the toilet seat covers your grandma puts on. Like
it sounds like it was your alley.
Covered in,
Yeah, it's my favorite thing. Tell me more.
It looked funny, but it was probably, if you're allergic, you should probably stay away from that. The thing was dusty as hell. Well, that's how my vintage 30 journey started, and but shortly afterwards, my band went on an indefinite hiatus that still lasts until today. We're not officially broken up, but I haven't seen those guys in years.
Yep.
You know how that is. But I started getting interested in speakers and cabinets, and shortly after that, I got the 2 Notes Torpedo Live, which is probably the best piece of gear I ever bought, because that really helped me develop as a player as well, because I was able to hear myself properly and actually crank the amps at home. And I got into speakers. I got a Harley Benton cab with V30s, and later on a Zilla custom cab with one side was a V30, the other was a neon creamback. And I started reading up about the V30s, and I started seeing all these Facebook group and forum debates. The English-made speakers were supposed to sound better than the Chinese-made speakers, and all the OEM versions. And somehow this debate bothered me, because depending on who you ask, you get a different answer. Either they sound the same, the English ones sound vastly superior to the Chinese ones. But from an engineering standpoint, that didn't really make sense to me, because Celestion said nothing changed, same machines, same processes, same materials. So purely and if the quality assurance is the same as well, they should sound the same. So I decided I'd want to investigate that. So I started doing a bit of research on the speaker, and pretty quickly realized I'd bitten off more than I wanted to chew. But I don't know, I'm mentally kind of committed already. So I found out that there were several versions of the Vintage 30. I think just looking at the 8 and 16 ohm versions, there's like, I don't know, 16, 17, maybe 18 versions I was able to find with all the special editions and everything. And there's this Stephen Fryette quote out there that says that they changed the design somewhere in 1997, and that Mesa Boogie insisted on the original design, which became their OEM speaker. I don't know if that's true or not. I haven't been able to verify that. But then I figured, okay, so I need to find ones in 8 and 16 ohm before and after 1997 to see how they compare. And so I had at that stage amassed a healthy amount of speakers, and then Christian Kohle on Kohle Keller Studios, he released that video with Nolly, the V30 Masterclass. And I thought,
I watched that
crap.
too.
Nolly's beat me to it. Everything that he touches turns to gold. The plugins, he's got awesome guitars, fantastic producer. Even the shape of his skull is better than mine. He's done it. So I watched that video and I thought, that's interesting. Because Nolly speaks about the eras and how the cones probably differ throughout the years, because they're made of paper pulp, which, as I can imagine, is a really difficult material to actually control the production parameters on, especially, thickness and density and all that. So that's going to make them sound different. And I thought to myself, okay, if I want to do this, I need to get even more speakers for different years and see how they differentiate to each other. And this whole process, from deciding I want to investigate that to actually doing the test, that took something like 4.5 years. I was always on eBay and Reverb and stuff looking for speakers, because I don't know, it became a fun hobby, very obsessive, probably not very healthy, financially not the wisest decision I've ever made, but I really enjoyed it. And earlier this year, I finally had all the speakers together I thought I needed for the test. When I started, I realized maybe I should get 1-2 more for the 8 and 16 ohm test, which luckily I was able to find very quickly. And I ended up doing the test. Spent about 5 weeks every evening where I had free time, either planning the test, scripting it, filming it, evaluating that, and then, finally releasing the video, which at that stage I thought, probably won't get much attention. It's an hour-long video by this tiny channel nobody's ever heard about a very niche topic, but the response has blown me away. I was very surprised by the attention it got, and the feedback is, in fact, nobody so far has told me I'm an idiot or disagreed with me. It's basically, yeah, thank you for making this. This is cool, and that was very gratifying for me. Very, very rewarding.
Very, very well deserved. I'm just looking up the stats on the video now as well, just so we can quote some things. But so fascinating. I imagine, as for you as an engineer, as soon as you latch onto that point where you can see there's going to be variability, that becomes your into, okay, now I need to now I need to dive into this. I guess it's not dissimilar to me, it was sort of like what you did. I'm sure you've watched the Jim Lil videos that he's been doing, where, you know, he's got this out of nowhere come out and done these videos, which are like, you know, what makes a guitar sound good, or, you know.
Oh, yeah, I know the ones you mean. Yeah.
So I think he kind of hit this sweet spot where it's nerdy, but it's not too nerdy, and it's pretty accessible for, I don't think there's like really a general guitar public, but if you're somebody who hasn't spent years and years analyzing these kind of things or being really interested in niche topics, he kind of presents it as though he's presenting to a general audience. So there was stuff that I was watching where I was like, yeah, of course. Like, who doesn't know this? But then you sort of realize, well, actually, the majority of people who play guitar or get into amps, you know, they wouldn't know this. So to me, it was sort of like a similar thing like that, where the way you were able to, I guess, find that, go beyond, well, you know, country of manufacture is the only point of difference. So like, actually there's, you know, there has to be variations in the material processing that could possibly result. And then we do a bunch of tests. And I really liked that you were able to kind of present that for the people who are going to be interested in this, you know, which are probably like mostly rock and metal guitar players who have done recording with these speakers and either torn their hair out or kind of loved it. And they've loved it so much that they've ended up tearing their hair out, because then they try find other cabinets and things like that, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, like, last year you probably had lots and lots of hair.
Well, no, that's I lost my hair about 10 years beforehand, but yes, it was a bit of a head scratcher sometimes. How am I going to present all these parameters? How am I going to sort out this mess that I have? Because even when I started actually reamping them all in my garage, I thought, how am I going to process this properly so that it makes sense to anybody? And if you compare it to Jim Lil's videos, that's a great compliment to me, because his style of presentation is excellent. So it's really easy to watch and very enjoyable. So
he's like Mythbusters, but for guitar. You know, that's like just I remember watching Mythbusters as a teenager and just sort of being like, this is really easy to follow. Like, even if you're not into science, you just have a good time. So it's, you know, for me, as somebody who does the YouTube thing and does plenty of shilling as well, I just love when people go above and beyond with stuff where it's like, this is sort of the video that, you know, 19-year-old me needed to see and didn't, because I was, you know, just playing through some cab and I was like, well, that sounds slightly better than the other thing. That's weird. It must just be a good one. So kind of creating content that, I mean, was that a thing for you where it was like, this is stuff that when you were starting out, you would have wanted to see?
Yeah, absolutely. And first and foremost, I made this test for me because I really wanted to know I really wanted to crack this nut. It didn't leave me alone. What is the difference? Is there a difference between the Chinese and the UK ones? Do Mesa Boogie or Marshall ones really sound different? Which, up to my test, I pretty much thought they would, or I kind of hoped they would, because that would be cooler. That would be more mysterious, the special Marshall ones, the special Mesa ones. So first and foremost, I made this test for myself. And secondly, I wanted to make it interesting enough for somebody else who might have the same questions to be able to follow it without falling asleep. So that's why I added, 100 different time codes in the description as well to help people navigate, because I doubt very few people are going to want to see me waffle on about speakers for an hour. So
well,
I tried to yeah, well, 2 people. There we go.
Waffling is good. I said I haven't watched the video yet, which I've got some questions for you, so we'll get to those soon, and then it'll be interesting to check that, you know, to watch after we have this conversation. But it's just funny because like I've been talking about long form videos, because since we had Jason on from Head First a couple of weeks ago, I mean I've watched like countless hours and hours sitting there just watching these amps and like how things get modded. And then I'm like, you know, you talking about trying to crack the nut with speakers for your own benefit. For me, I love learning something, and when I get really obsessed, I really have to understand it. So Leon, I think I was messaging you like end of last week, because I really don't know how to read a schematic. I really didn't know. And then I was like, right, tonight's the night. and I sat there and I was like, wait, what? What does a coupling capacitor mean? And what does a phase inverter do? And then it's all of a sudden to pull the pieces together, and then bam, you learn something, and your life is slightly different and better. I have that obsessive sort of gene or obsessive part of my personality. So it's really interesting. I can sit through an hour-long video on this stuff if I know I'm going to get something out at the end of it to my interest. So thank you for doing it for the community.
Yeah. Which brings me to what of your preconceptions were challenged and what were confirmed when you did this. Kind of, for anyone who hasn't seen the video, go and watch the video. It's on John's YouTube channel. You can go and check it out. It's a great video.
And can I just ask one question just before that? Because how many speakers did you test?
In the test I had 53 of them.
Okay, 53. That's a good sample size. Well, is it?
Yeah, really. Well, overall, yes, probably. But within all the parameters, to look at all the parameters, I probably would have wanted even more. But at some stage, where does obsession or passion stop, and where does insanity begin?
Well, actually, what was the Nolly? Because I watched that Nolly video. This is a long time ago, which is when I found out when my cabinet was from, because I got interested what was in my V30 cab, and it was from the Nolly approved era of V30s, which I thought was really funny. Yeah. But yeah, I know he did this effect, a similar sort of thing, like bought a bunch of speakers. But it's just funny, like I know when I said, 53, that's a good sample size, your face really were like, you never know. Like it's because I guess you have to compare apples and oranges, you have to compare apples and apples, you have to do the whole thing. So my cabinet filled with four 12-inch speakers from the same year and the same batch all sound different. So I guess you also have to be able to determine what is different about each speaker, and then to the years, like it's a very confusing, difficult task. So,
So no, feel free to interrupt me anytime, because I'm so deep in this. I may not be grounded all the time. It might not make total sense to you. What I'm talking about, because I forget that I'm knee deep into this. So. Nolly, at least in the video, said, and I have no reason to doubt that, said he did something similar, that he had some like 80 V30s, which is another healthy sample size. But with regards to the variants I saw, like every speaker was different. No two speakers were exactly the same, especially in the high end, like in the presence and brilliance range. That's where the spread really gets big. And
what do you determine as presence and brilliance in terms of an actual frequency range?
Presence would be, that's what I read was, I think, between 4 and 6K presence, and anything above that was pretty much brilliance range. That's at least what I read in several guides, because I looked that up a bit to not sound like a complete idiot when I was talking about the
I think that's not at least from my audio engineering background, because it can be anything. Like I've heard people say mid-range to mean 2K and mid-range to mean like 300 hertz. So it's like nothing means anything. So I just for my own benefit, I need to just kind of work out what that means.
Probably a good idea to ask that, yes, because it's probably not. There's probably not an organization standards of frequency bands.
No, but do you know
determines this is.
And I said this to Leon years ago. I think you should make a video about this, Uncle Leon, but just take guitar words and try and qualify what they mean. Like, what does muddy mean? And what does flubby mean? And because it's really like, it's meaningless. I guess we can all understand sort of vaguely what they are, but there isn't a society of people writing this stuff down and really making it usable. It's just kind of colloquial language, I suppose. So sorry, I interrupted you, but like, in terms of that spread and brilliance and presence and stuff is what you're saying.
That's okay. With my own videos, even I like to play guitar world buzzword bingo, because we all tend to use these terms that aren't really defined. They mean different things to different people, but sometimes we're just left with these words because there's no better way to describe them. That's just the
it reminds me
challenge of sonic things,
Reminds me of what's his name? He's an author, Michael Pollan. And I was listening to a podcast that he was guesting on, and he wrote a book about psychedelics and psychedelic treatments, and microdosing stuff for treatment of depression and addiction and people nearing death and those kind of things. And he kind of went on this thing. He's like, when I interviewed people about their experience with this, all they had were these kind of like platitudes, like, oh, you just feel at one with the world. And, you know, he's like, eventually I decided, you know, like, to paraphrase him, he was like, well, I better go and like take a bunch of these things. So he took the psychedelic drugs and he was like, yeah, I just found myself saying the same things. It's like, these are kind of the only ways you can actually try to communicate this experience. And I feel like guitar sounds and music is a bit like that, where you've played enough, you have a ballpark idea of what warm means.
Yeah.
But then no two people will agree that the same sound is warm. You know, it's like, oh, it's warm. And someone will be like, oh, it's a bit sterile or something like that. So, as you said, we're kind of left with these terms. And I guess it does, if you're sort of saying, hey, to me, I'd identify it with this frequency range or this kind of thing. So I'm glad we're grappling with these definitions.
Slightly related to that, I had a singing teacher a couple of years ago who said the phrase, like, teaching singing is you teach on sensation, which I thought was really interesting. It's like, you need to feel the thing in your throat or in your voice or in your head. Like, I can only say so much, but I need to get you to the point where you can feel it, and then you'll understand what it is that I'm trying to teach you, or how to activate that as you sing or whatever. I guess there's like similarities to that within playing guitar. Like, when something sounds chunky, to me, that's like when I'm sitting in front of an amp, I go, zhung, zhung, zhung. All right, that's got the chunk to it. That's got the push to it even. It's a hard thing to like even demonstrate on recording sometimes, or listen back to in a recording. Yeah, it's just, all these things mean so much different, or can mean such different things to so many people. So sorry, tangents. It's tangent central over here at the Gear Podcast. But yeah, getting back. Sorry.
Yes, I'll try not to hop on your tangent, because I thought that was very.
Oh well, please do if you like. That's up to you.
Because singing is a great example, or singing lessons. Because I've briefly had took some singing lessons a few years ago, and the difference to guitar is you can't see what's going on in your body. It's a challenge to kind of connect what's being said to you by the instructor or teacher to what is actually happening. While your guitar teacher can tell you, look, you need to put your finger down close to the fret that you're actually playing and not far away, so it doesn't buzz.
Yep.
Like that's the feedback loop there is much easier than with things that we can't see. And things with the speaker thing was similar, the reason I was happy that I had this tool, Room EQ Wizard, so that I could actually visualize what these speakers were doing, because I don't have a great ear. I have an average ear, and I can hear that they sound different, but hard to describe what the difference is. While I could use these frequency response graphs to actually use them as a bit of a roadmap. Okay, that is the area I'm looking at. I can apply high pass and low pass filters to zone in on that area and actually determine, okay, that is the difference that I'm hearing, and then describe it better. But where were we? Oh yeah, sample sizes. 53 speakers sounds like a lot, and it is a lot to handle. But really, I have gaps in those years as well. Like, I have no speakers between 2004 and 2008. So I didn't cover those at all. They may sound different in there. They may not, because the variance within the speakers, even from the same batch, was so large, especially in the high end, it becomes somewhat hard to spot the patterns. Is there a pattern there? Yep. So the best way I was able to determine that Nolly was right about the early 2000 speakers was I just grouped these graphs. I took like all the graphs I had from 2000 to 2004, stuck them on one graph, exported the JPEG, and then I took all the speakers I had after that, put them all on one graph, and exported that to a JPEG. And then I just kind of flicked back and forth really fast, and I could see then, okay, look, there's an actual noticeable difference, statistically relevant, in that around 5K, between 5 and 6K. The ones from the early 2000s had noticeably less lower sound pressure levels in those frequencies than the ones that came after that and the ones that came before that. And that was cool to be able to find. But if I had even more speakers, that pattern might have been more obvious even. And with regards to your question, Leon, the preconceived notions that were either confirmed or denied, I think the biggest difference was, or the most obvious thing, was the difference between 8 and 16 ohm speakers. And that was somewhat expected, because they're actually built differently. They have different voice coils. And again, a Cola Killer video where he had Ignacio from Jensen on, he elaborated on that a bit. He said that the 16 ohm voice coil is lighter than the 8 ohm voice coil, which sounds a bit counterintuitive because you'd expect more ohms to be heavier, but they probably use thinner wires for the same amount of winds. I don't know I guess for the speakers, I don't know any of this. This is just me guessing. I guess they're going for similar inductance for both the 16 and 8 ohm speakers, and it's a big formula with several variables. So I guess anyway, the 16 ohm voice coil is lighter, and those pretty much all of them generated lower sound pressure levels in the mids, like between 1 and 4K. Generally, they showed. And they had the tendency to have a bit more high end, but that wasn't quite as clear because the variance in the high end was pretty large. What wasn't confirmed, which I hope would have been confirmed, is that the Marshall and the Mesa OEM speakers, they don't really seem to be any different than the regular speakers. Maybe they're QC'd a little different, but I couldn't spot any distinctive characteristic that would determine this is a Mesa Boogie OEM speaker or this is a Marshall speaker. Like a lot of people say that the Marshall speakers are brighter than the regular ones. Couldn't see that, couldn't confirm that. Much like other people say that the Mesa Boogie OEM speakers sound smoother than the regular speakers. Couldn't see that either. Basically, speakers from the same production year seem to fall within certain tolerance bands. Sometimes the Marshall was brighter, sometimes it was smoother, sometimes the Mesa Boogie speaker was brighter than the regular one, sometimes it was smoother. There doesn't seem to be any physical differences to them that guarantee a different sonic signature.
I mean, my Mesa Boogie vintage 30 cab 4x12 that I had was an 8 ohm cabinet. My Marshall cabinet is a 16 ohm cabinet. So, I mean, it's possible if you like the one thing that's really annoying about looking any of this information up that I find is you've got like now 20 years of information on various forums that are so biased and so unscientific. And in fact, I was doing some reading on some apps last night and I'm like going back to posts from like 2009 and you have no idea what these people are hearing and what they're testing the thing on, how loud things are. It's like your sound memory is so short. Like if you don't hear something bam there and bam there, you have no idea if it's actually accurate or not. So in terms of like, maybe it's smoother or brighter. Maybe there is a difference. Maybe just because the Mesa cabinets are loaded with 8 ohm speakers and some are loaded with 16 ohm speakers. That might be enough, or the construction of the cab might be enough to trick you into thinking it's this. It might be the sum of the parts, not just the individual speaker itself. I don't know.
Absolutely. The cab makes a big difference. The grill cloth, especially, because depending what the grill cloth is made of, it'll take off more high end or less high end. Like the orange cab you have back there, that's this thick wicker stuff that tends to take off a lot of high end. The Mesa Boogie grill cloths I hear are treated specially to absorb some of the high end. Then if the cab is front loaded, it'll sound a bit different. If it has no grill at all, like the Engel cabs have these metal grates in front of them that will let through different frequencies, so that the cab plays a big difference as well. Also, the difference between 8 and 16 ohms, as you said, the Marshall tends to use 16 ohm speakers, whereas the Mesa 412s are typically 8 ohm speakers. That's going to make a big difference. And what you said as well, that's something that bothered me as well. A lot of other tests on YouTube, while they had the right motivation, they kind of muddled up the parameters. Like if you compare two different cabs, if you compare speakers using two different cabs, you're going to have all these different cabinet influences in that test as well. Much like comparing an 8 ohm to a 16 ohm speaker, that's going to be, well, as I found out, that makes pretty much the biggest difference of all the parameters.
What cabinet were you putting everything? Was it in a 4x12?
No, I specifically a few years ago, in fact, bought an ISO cab for this Gossmann SG box made by this German dude. I just read up ISO cabs. I was looking for Randall ISO cab used for a while on Jet City. I think made an ISO cab for a while, but I couldn't find any of those, so I ended up buying a new one. In fact, because this ISO cab, the way it's laid out, like you just kind of pop the speaker in from the top, it's facing upward. And you have these clamps where you can have you can attach two mics to it. I specifically took that cab for two reasons, because I could mount a fixed microphone to that in a position that allowed me to actually take out and put speakers back in without bumping the mic. So that way I could ensure that the microphone wouldn't move at all. The position was always the same. I actually glued little wooden blocks onto the sides of this isocap so that I could position the speaker exactly the same. I marked where the bolt holes would be, and I pushed two sides up against these wooden blocks, so the location would be exactly the same. I rotated it so that the glue blobs where the wires come into the cone were always in the same position. So that was very important to me. My inner test engineer came through, and I haven't had this much fun doing nerdy stuff in years since I started as a test engineer. I missed that job. In fact,
that's awesome. My question is, did you say, like, so you mentioned that you took pains to ensure that the speakers were positioned the same as well as having the mic position. Did you test, say, the same speaker and like rotating it, say 90 degrees at a time and seeing if the frequency response changed at all? Or
I didn't rotate it. I didn't do that yet, but I did a few other tests. Like I tested the same speaker in different days to see if it would record the same graph. Because if it would give me different graphs in different days, then then the test would have been useless. I also tested for the frequency sweeps how if the power amp volume has any effect on the graph, which it seems it doesn't really. As long as you have a certain volume, it just kind of, the sound pressure level goes up. The shape pretty much remains the same. If your volume is too low, the low end might become a bit floppy and the high end gets a bit noisy. But other than that, power amp volume doesn't seem to have a huge effect.
What power amp did you use? Sorry, Leon. Jumping in.
For the frequency sweeps, I used the power amp I had, which is a KSR PA50, loaded with two KT77s. And for the reamp tracks, I used an EVH 5153 on the red channel because that's pretty much a bread and butter amp. Everybody knows how they sound, and most people tend to like them.
Yep. And what mic did you use?
I used a regular SM57.
Yep.
I considered getting a measurement microphone for this to at least record the frequency sweeps, but then I thought, that's fine and good, it's very scientific, but it doesn't really have that much to do with the real world application, because most of the time when you're going to hear a vintage 30 at a show or on a record, I guess 90% of the time you're going to hear it through an SM57 anyway. So if I can't record differences with an SM57, it's probably not relevant.
Yep.
So
I would agree with that.
I could talk about this for hours. I cut about half the stuff out of that video. I could have easily made it double the length, but I was afraid of boring people to death. Well, so I'll just bore your audience to death instead.
Do it. So I there's certain prominent people on the internet who kind of really advocate against the 57 on a V30, especially for, say, like metal guitar tones. What would you say for people who don't enjoy that particular combination for whatever reason? What do you find about was there a particular pattern across all the speakers you tested with that setup where you could identify, hey, they have this, they're particularly hyped in a certain region, or was there actually enough variation through the 53 speakers you tested where it sort of just more comes down to the individual speaker? I guess a better way to say that is, like, would you say that there is a definable V30 character?
Yes, 100%.
Yeah.
Definitely.
What were the consistent things from speaker to speaker that you noticed?
Well, almost all of them look the same from 20 hertz up to about 1.5K. Some speakers had, well, there's a slope that builds up to, in my isocap anyway, 125, 130 hertz. Sometimes some speakers were 1 or 2 dBs more quiet than others there, but the shape was the same. And other than that, like from that resonant peak at 130 hertz all the way up to 1.5K, they're pretty much identical, bang on. Well, if they have the same impedance anyway, the 16 ohms have a little lower sound pressure levels around there. Then at about 1.5K, the differences start to materialize a bit. There's maybe some peaks and valleys are shifted a bit. Some speakers have more peaks and valleys, but generally speaking, all the way up to about 3.5, 4K, they have very similar shapes. And at above 4K, that's when the variances really start to kick in. No, at about 5K, depending on the speaker, 5 or 6K, that's when a big drop in sound pressure level happens. And the smoother ones, like the ones from the early 2000s, they drop off earlier, around 5K. While some of the brighter ones, some people call them harsh. Other people said they prefer those in the test. I read that some people found those early 2000 speakers that I like so much, they sounded kind of muddy or muffled. Well, they start dropping off at between 5 and 6K anyway. That's when the sound pressure levels get significantly lower. But they still matter. Those lower sound pressure level frequencies still matter. I kind of honed in with low and high pass filters to really see what bands really make a difference. Like anything over 6, 7K is much more quiet than the meat and potatoes area between like 500 hertz and 4K, but it still makes a difference. And that's where some of the defining characteristics of the different eras come in. But to get back to the original question, sorry, I went off on a tangent there. The shapes are still somewhat similar in the presence and brilliance range, but the variances become much bigger. They kind of spread. Some speakers, like my 2004s, they get very spiky. They have these big bumps over 10K even. Others really kind of fizzle out in the high end. Others are, but basically the peaks and valleys become more numerous and they become more extreme, especially like over 8 hertz. Really, we see some extreme spikes and some massive dips that just kind of happen on very specific frequencies. They're very spiky. They just kind of shoot off into nowhere and then they pop back up again a few hertz later.
Yeah, that's quite funny. I mean, like when I think about any guitar speaker, anything above about 8K, I really don't care about. In a recording, not all the time, but in a recording situation, oftentimes I'll low pass filter out the extreme top end anyway. Or if you're going into 8K, it's maybe not extreme top end, but I'll get rid of a lot of that. And I'm a little bit, I'm not super sensitive to that range acoustically in the room when I play. I feel like it just disappears. Like it gets so chaotic when you reach a certain amount of like cycles per second, like particularly in that sort of like 3, 4, 5K range and above. I've used Room EQ Wizard a lot for testing my studio monitors in my room, and like that range, the graph is just like never the same, never what you think it's going to be. So yeah, for me, I'm always just like, nah, it up there is what it is. It's funny that there was like again, I haven't listened through the test, so I can't say how much it affects in the testing. I'm really keen to check that out after we have a chat. The thing that I'll just quickly ask you, I'm obsessed with like 3 to 4 kilohertz in speakers at the moment, like that range specifically, like 3.1K, 3.4K, somewhere around there. And this is like a personal battle that I'm having with all guitar. It's modelers. It's like, recordings like in the 7 guitar cabinets and like how many speakers I have in there at the moment. It just seems like that range, I always have this spike, and it's the thing that pisses me off the most and I'm always trying to deal with. In the V30s that you tested, was there any difference in that range specifically that you could comment on? Because I feel like before you do answer, in my preferred like Marshall 4x12, it doesn't feel like there's as much of an issue in that cab, and I'm not sure if that's why I like it. Think that is, and even the one speaker in that cabinet that I like so much, it feels like it's a tiny bit smoother. But yeah, was there anything you noticed about that range in the speakers you tested?
They were all pretty similar in that range, except for the early 2000 speakers, funnily again, because that was the second thing I noticed about those. They seem to have a bit more in that range, a bit more 3 to 4K, yes, funnily enough.
Actually, I didn't ask this too. Using SM57, whereabouts did you place the mic?
I placed it right where the dust cap meets the cone, and as close as I could get away with without bumping into the microphone when changing speakers. So ideally, I would have wanted it to be a bit closer if I were actually recording music with it. But I had to place it a bit further away to not screw up my test. Because I was terrified of ending up at speaker 52 and then crashing into the microphone and then turning all the results into garbage, or just,
Yeah. Well, look,
was a big fear, man.
Yeah, just release it anyway. Don't say anything. No one would be the wiser. It's fine. It is actually,
this one's really bad.
were there any variances in the dust cap over those?
Yes,
there were.
Yes.
That to me seems like when you're building a speaker, that seems like a point where variation could be introduced during manufacturing, right?
Yeah. Funnily enough, I never really looked at the dust caps until Glenn Fricker made that video on the new vintage 30s. I don't know if you've seen that, but he made a video about some 2022 vintage 30s that he got, and he compared them to his 2006 or 2007 Engel stock V30s in his Engel, and he determined that the new vintage 30s sounded much smoother than the ones he had, and that they must have changed something. And he pointed out that the dust cap on the new vintage 30 that he got was almost transparent. You could almost see through it.
Okay.
And that got me thinking. I never really looked at the at those dust caps, and so I actually bought two new V30s just to test this theory, and they did have more clear dust caps than the other speakers of mine. The only other pair of speakers I had that almost had clear speakers was a pair from 1995. So
okay.
I thought maybe the man is onto something. Maybe the dust caps do make a difference. And I looked at them all. I took photos of them all. I touched them all carefully. And between, actually physical differences, that was the biggest difference I found, because some of them were really hard, stiff. Mm-hmm. Some of them were soft, like as if they were made of fabric. Others felt terrifyingly brittle. Some of them were darker. The earliest ones on my earliest V30s, they were smaller. They had a smaller diameter, and they were more pointy. The V30s MF I have here from a Marshall Mode 4 cab, they're flat as pancakes, while the others are pretty conical. I inspected all the dust cabs. I took photos of them to see if I could measure or hear certain characteristics and determine that's the dust cap. But I couldn't really find anything. But I still think the dust cap might have an influence. So I bought a couple of them here, and I'm going to do some more tests. I'm going to sacrifice one of the V30s, remove the dust cap entirely, and test how that sounds. And then I've got ones made of fabric here. I've got ones made of paper here. I'm just going to glue them on and redo the test and see if that sounds any different. I have a theory that it's not so much the material of the dust cap or how much air they let through. I think it has to do with the moving mass of the speaker, or the parts of the speaker that move. The heavier that is, or the weight of that will have influence on the sound, because I think that might be why the 16 ohm speakers sound a little different to the 8 ohm speakers. And I don't have it here right now, but I have Bad Cat amplification used to have an OEM V30 as well.
Okay.
And they don't have doping on the speaker suspension, so they're matte black. There's no shiny black stuff on it. It's all completely matte black, and the dust caps look a bit different as well. And they, even though they're 8 ohm speakers, behave a bit like 16 ohm speakers. They have lower sound pressure levels in the mids. So I'm thinking maybe this has to do with the moving mass of the speakers. Maybe the heavier the speaker is, the more, or the heavier the moving mass of the speaker is, the more pronounced they will be in the mids. So I'm going to see if I can actually confirm this or debunk this. So
that's awesome.
That's another test I'll be doing.
Yeah. I actually had to...
interesting.
Yeah. I replaced a couple of dust caps on a T75 cab that I picked up earlier this year. And it's the first time I've tried to do it, but I was thinking like, man, it's just... the dust cap was about $5 or $10 Australian, so that's easy. And I bought the glue to do it. And it was an easy job. And then my almost 4-year-old son came and visited the studio a few weeks ago, and I don't have the grills. Yep. He literally walked in. You wouldn't believe it. He walked into the live room because he hadn't been in there in ages, and grills are off. He said, "Oh mate, have a look at these cabinets." And I couldn't believe he went straight for the one I just replaced, like finger out, bam. So it's okay. I'll be able to. I'll unpress it in. But bloody kids, mate. Actually, another semi-related story to that. I remember a friend of mine, he left his 70s Fender Twin with me a long time ago when he moved away. But he had replaced one of the speakers in it, and he brought the amp to my house and brought the old speaker that was broken. He said, "Oh, one day I'll get this fixed up." And he and his son came around, and there's the amp sitting there, and he put the speaker on the ground. And his son stomp, foot straight through the middle of the speaker. like gone. Like that's gone, completely gone. I've still have the speaker. That needs a bit of a birthday, as we would say.
Complete recall, probably.
Completely,
yes.
yeah. That was very funny.
I don't know what it is. Irresistible to children. I think because these kind of just the shape.
Yeah,
I want to push that.
Well, yeah, that's very satisfying. I was going to say actually, the positioning people say about placing this is a recording, but put the mic kind of where the dust cap and the cone meet, because this is something that I always do, and pretty much since about 2014, I reckon. So that's 9 years I've been recording guitars the same way, and I think on a V30 that's absolutely the best place for it. But something that I can't really confirm or deny with this is like a greenback speaker has a much smaller dust cap, and so if you place the mic in the exact same position, I don't know if the positioning of that mic on that point of like effectively where the glue is the best position for it, or if it's the fact that with a V30, like, you're just a little bit off center a bit more, so it smooths everything out a little bit. You know what I mean? I think like just to give the blanket advice of like put the mic on the edge of the dust cap is probably not across all speakers. So
it happens to be good for a V30, but
yeah.
It's necessarily the rule,
because I've done it on greenbacks and I've been like, man, this feels a bit bright, and then you tweak the mic a little bit, maybe you even just like twist it or turn it a little bit sideways, and it does sort of smooth it out. It's one of those it's a really good starting point, I think, particularly with a V30. I think it's a perfect place for a V30. I think it's one of those things within recording guitars, and like T75's different again, because I think they've got much bigger dust caps, if I'm not mistaken, than V30, maybe. Anyway,
I think they do.
Yeah,
yep.
It's just funny. It's like I don't know if that's the best position because it happens to be where they meet and there's a bit of glue there or something, or if it just is like it happens to be a nice place away from the center of the cone where it mellows
the perfect
stuff out.
Distance from the center. Yeah,
it's weird. It's something I'd like to experiment with one day if I can be ever be bothered.
Interesting though, because I mean, and certainly everything you've said today, which just kind of reinforces the video you made, was it decouples your thinking from make and model to actual like important stuff, which are probably like material properties, the actual thing and the actual physics of how a speaker works and how you construct a speaker. Similar to, the whole tone wood thing is like, no, it's very, very important. No, it's not important. It's like, well, look, what is a piece of wood, and it's like, and what contributes to its material properties, and could you mimic that with other materials? How would you standardize it? And there's a very you could argue that what you've done with like the speakers is probably in the wash considerably more impactful on your end recorded guitar sound, but all of these things kind of matter when you approach it from that like materials sense, which I like, rather than like, oh, it's UK versus Chinese, which doesn't really mean anything.
No. Well, what it looks like, I'm not, well, I can't guarantee this because I'd need a much bigger sample size. It seems to me that the defining characteristic, or what really makes the difference between a smooth and a bright sounding V30, is the material composition of the cone. Because I have a few V30s here with 1777 cones, which is the Celestion's lead cone that they use on the T75 and the K100, for example. These were OEM speakers that were made for Hughes and Kettner in the early 2000s, and I didn't present them in the first video because it was so long. I cut that out. I'm making a separate video for my weird exotic V30s. I would have thought that these would sound massively different to the regular V30s because they use a different type of cone, and they do sound a bit different, but the difference isn't huge. Like, these V30s don't sound like T75s and don't sound like K100s. They still very much sound like V30s, which I found very interesting because it's not necessarily the cone type used, but it has to do with the material. They very much fit in with the regular V30s from their same production year.
Right. Oh, interesting. That's very unintuitive, but yet interesting, That's why you do these tests, I guess.
Same with the new V30s. I got two new V30s, and one of them sounded very much like the early 2000s, like in Glenn Fricker's video. And the other one, even though they have the same production date on the speaker, sounded very much like the other newer V30s I had, like from 2019, 2018. And when I was looking through my spreadsheet, kind of marking which speakers can I finally sell now, I noticed something that I missed, that both my new speakers, despite having the same production date, have different batch codes on the cones. The one that sounded smoother had a later batch code. So I can only assume it was made later. And I thought, crap, shit, it's not over. I need to look into this. So I bought four more new V30s, and they all have even newer batch codes. And I haven't tried them out yet, but I'm very curious to see if these sound like the new V30, like the early 2000 V30s now. So, yeah, I'm still obsessed with this bullshit.
Yep.
It feels like though this is the first. You know, you feel like you're going to do this test and make some like big discoveries, but realize you only discover how much you don't know. And you start actually, okay, now I can properly start testing the variables, which I didn't even know existed.
Yes, I was half expecting to having to do this twice, because usually when I do something the first time, it turns out garbage. I need to redo it again.
I've had that experience.
But thankfully, or luckily, I seem to have overthought this process so much that it worked the first time. I didn't have to reamp 53 speakers again.
Cool bananas. Well, I got a question, because you keep mentioning the different eras of V30. So can you just define what that means? Like, we're just obviously talking different year ranges, or is it batches, or what defines that?
Again, really, to fully determine that, I'd need to test a few more speakers, because I was expecting 4 eras, or I grouped my speakers into 4 eras for this test, which was all the speakers I had from before the year 2000, the speakers that Noddy defined as the golden age, or that special age between between 2000 and 2003, 2004. Then I thought there's going to be a modern era, so anything from today down to I expected something like 2010, and then an era in between, which I had a few 2008s, 2010s, but to my surprise, those 2008, 2010s pretty much fit in with the modern era. The early 2000 speakers had a very distinctive character, and anything before that was very hard for me to actually pinpoint, because for one thing, I didn't have that many V30s from the early 90s and late 80s, because they're kind of hard to find these days. And it seemed like the variances in those first 1.5 decades were much larger than they were later. And I speculated about that, why that might be. Could it be that these were just worn in more? Do we see more break-in? Will that change them? What kind of spoke against that was that I saw a lot of variance within pairs, or speakers that I bought in pairs. So it's fair to assume that they were used and stored the same way. Another thing was that maybe I thought the different speakers were actually different designs in the beginning. Maybe the Marshall V30 started off as something different than the regular V30, and maybe they converged them later. But again, the difference isn't consistent enough. So my theory is that just back in the late 80s and early 90s, production tolerances were just larger, because workshops were different there. I pretty much grew up in a workshop environment, albeit in a different industry, but the mentality towards production processes has changed massively in the last few decades. So I presume that Celestion and or Kurt Müller, who makes the cones for the Celestion speakers, just weren't to make them as consistently back in the late 80s and early 90s. So that's my theory about that. So basically, I'm seeing 3 different eras. Everything before 2000, the Nolly golden era from 2000 to 2003, 2004, and everything that came after that has they're a bit brighter. They don't fall off around 5K, but later around 6K. That's where the dip in sound pressure level happens.
Right.
But we might be entering a new era for the V30 again, as I hope to find out very shortly with the newest speakers that might sound closer to the early 2000 speakers than the previous ones before that. The question I would have there is that coincidence or the cones. Is the material that the cones are made of just within that spec at the moment, because Kurt Müller are sourcing their material, their cellulose, from some other place now? Or is it deliberate? Did Celestion want this? Was the cone material redesigned? Well, I don't know that, and I haven't asked Celestion I won't. I don't expect an answer from them anyway.
Yeah.
So.
You just mentioned speaker break-in. Was that something? I mean, presumably with that many speakers, you can't break in every speaker the same way, or new ones to compare them to the old ones. So, was there any consideration for that as you're doing the tests? Did you break in a speaker to see what it would do to it?
Not yet. Interesting you should say that, because that's something I've planned with the initial 2 new speakers I bought. I want to see if I can actually record speaker break-in, because some of the speakers in this test were new, some of them were very well used, and from the data I had, I couldn't really pinpoint that there is speaker break-in. I couldn't really see it, so I'm going to try to make it visible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of the new speakers I got, the less smooth sounding one, and I'm going to put it back in my ISO cab and then reamp the bejesus out of it for a couple of weeks, and then kind of do the Room EQ Wizard sweep every 100 hours or every week or so, just to see if I can see a shift happening there at some stage. And then hopefully I see a shift, because the experts that talk about speaker break-in, like Nolly or Ignacio from Jensen, they're pretty credible. Everything other than that they've said has turned out to be true. So I expect to see some difference there. And once I hopefully record that difference, I'm going to take that speaker out, put the other speaker in, reamp that for the same amount of time to see if that also shifts, and if it shifts in the same way.
Yep. I mean, it's sort of
you
like,
can tell I'm a bit obsessive about this kind of stuff.
What I like about it is that it is a little more testable than, say, trying to compare 2 electric guitars, or something like that, where there is that just via the nature of it. So it's so I'm looking forward to these videos already.
I expect it to exist, but I think it's going to be subtle. I don't think there's going to be huge shifts. It's going to be small.
Yeah, on that, I mean, firstly, the fact that you have an ISO cab makes breaking this in significantly easier than having to run the cab in another environment. Because I've thought about it on my speakers. Like, Leon, I've got your those warehouse speakers, the Reaper and the Green Beret, which sound really cool. But I thought, maybe they had, like, you didn't use and abuse them too much before they ended up at the studio, and I've used them a bit, but they certainly haven't been run for that long. So maybe if I just run them, like just let them go over the weekend or something, and then have a listen, see if it makes a difference. But you're still putting.
I feel like with those, I gave them the recommended play loud music through them for X number of hours thing. And I didn't really notice a difference between when I first put them in the cabin.
Oh, it's good to know you've already done it, but because I was going to say, like, doing it here is still, it's not impossible, but it's still a bit of a pain in the ass. It's not completely soundproof at the studio. It's, you're still going to be upsetting the neighbors. But what I was going to say though is, like, speaker break-in, it feels like it should make a difference, but it doesn't explain everything, because, if you've got like my 4x12 said, it's from the good era of V30s, they still all sound different. They have all been broken in for the same amount of time, and they still sound different. So it doesn't account for everything. It just accounts for a part of the sound. And mine, there is some pretty big differences between the top and bottom speakers, which I did test as well to see if it was just a case of them being close to the ground. So I flipped the cab upside down and it was still there. So it's sort of, that was my little test on that.
But did you actually change their positions in the cab?
I didn't, but it's a B cab, so the dimensions. Oh, I guess the dimensions aren't 100% the same, are they? Because it is a slightly angled back baffle. Yeah, I didn't do that, but.
Well, we know what Uncle Troy's up to over the weekend.
Well, mate, I'm going to go to Kalgoorlie and drink a lot of beer, so that's what I'm up to over the weekend, and play some guitar, which I will really enjoy. But maybe next weekend, mate.
There you go.
If I can get away from the children for a little bit.
It's what, 9 a.m. in the morning, and John's already hearing Australians talking about getting away from the kids and singing this.
Well, I'm Irish and I live in Germany. I'm no stranger to beer.
Well, I was going to say, I thought
beer's a big part of both cultures. Beer.
Yeah, because your accent definitely sounded Irish to me. So when you said you'd been living in Germany so long, I was kind of surprised.
I try to enunciate, but it still comes through.
Yeah. What was I going to say? Oh, I've forgotten. I had another question, but go on. Sorry, Leon.
I just had I've got a totally unrelated story to break this up. And as an Irishman living in Germany, I'm sure you'll appreciate this one, John. But when we toured through there with Ragdoll, we ended up picking up a gig where we played. This was in Hamburg. on the Reeperbahn. We played this small pub, and it turned out the next day was going to be the owner's birthday party at the pub. So we had the day off. So we were like, yeah, we'll jump up and play. We kind of played our set, and people were just like, keep going. So we just started exhausting our cover set. And someone asked for some like Dio era Sabbath. And we were just like, oh, yeah, I've listened to Heaven and Hell before. And we just butchered the song. Like, you know, we got about 2/3 of the way through it. It's like, how does this go? And it wasn't a train wreck, but it just wasn't rehearsed, you know. And, you know, people were drunk enough where they were into it. And this one guy came up, though, and he said, I won't do my terrible German accent, but he just said very particularly, thank you for attempting to play the song. It is clear that it was not rehearsed. Perhaps next time you will prepare better. And just kind of walked off. And I was like, I'd been there long enough where I was like, okay, that's just how people are.
Yeah.
But it just stuck with me as this like, if that was Australia, people would be like, oh, mate, you gave it a crack. Good on you. But there it was like, that was insufficiently prepared. Next time, do better.
That's very good.
Yeah.
Hey,
Hamburg's a great place. I'm just outside Hamburg still.
Yeah, right. So. Oh man, we had such
probably know the place.
Yeah, it was. Everyone was awesome. Like it was just a. Well, I think we were there for 4 or 5 days, but it felt like 4 or 5 weeks. Like people just they made you feel at home really quickly.
Yeah, Hamburg's a unique place. I haven't found a place like that anywhere, in fact. So the Hamburgians are cool. Mostly.
You know what it reminds me of? And if you ever come to Australia, especially Western Australia, and this ties in with one of Troy's gigs, it reminds me a lot of Fremantle in Western Australia.
Oh, yeah.
It's just way bigger. Port City, it's a bit bohemian. It's got the music connection. So, yeah, if you ever visit.
I have a few relatives in Australia, so I might find an excuse one day.
Yeah, please. Yeah, I'll make sure I have a steady supply of vintage 30s for you to listen to.
Yes, so that's something to feed on. Yes.
Yeah, and just sorry, while we're on tangents, because I need to just Leon, we've done this podcast enough times where our audience expects something completely unrelated to anything guitar. So can I just quickly, John, just like forgive me for this story because I did a gig with friend of the channel Nick on Saturday night. And we were playing a gig, but the football was on, so we were mostly just watching the football and strumming the guitar. I played to a combined total of 45,000 people on Saturday, which is a lot.
What was it? 44,999 at the Dockers and 1 at the
other that's gig? Right. Four actually.
Yeah, well there you go.
4 at the second gig. No, it was a little busier, but by the end of the gig there was literally only 4 people there. But we just went into the standard comedy routine of we could play music or we could just talk to these people and play a couple songs. But they were getting on it and they were a bit belligerent and they're all football fans. And one of the guys was a St Kilda fan, to tie it back into Jason Headfirst, who was a St Kilda fan. So anyway, you'll like this, Leon, but the last song we played was 500 Miles, Proclaimers.
Excellent.
And it gets to the da-da-da-da part at the end.
Oh, dear.
And so I went, Nick, the singer, went da-da-da-da, and I went, Ross Lyon, da-da-da-da, Nick Rewalt, just throwing out St Kilda Football Club greats. And Nick, for the first time, I've never seen it happen before, he just like stopped. He train wrecked the song because he was laughing so hard.
He laughed so hard?
Yeah. And I gave him the old Mo Robin, Jack Steele. He loved it. So I'm really sorry. This means nothing to you as a presumably not an AFL fan, but yeah.
Hey, Australia's contribution to culture is basically grown men walking around and screaming out the names of footballers from the 90s and then being like, yeah, it'd be the equivalent of just, like in every city there's that guy whose favorite band is Slayer and he basically just walks around at gigs going
fucking Slayer. Everybody knows that guy.
Yeah. Well, there's 26 million of them in Australia and they just have a sports team instead of Slayer. And some of them also really like Slayer. So yeah, I love that's a universal phenomenon. Oh, that's
actually
Slayer guy.
What was the football team that Lee played for in Germany? That was the Dockers, right?
Yeah. So totally unrelated. We're talking about Aussie rules football. Friends of ours were living over there at the time from Perth, and their bass player, who's a great great bass player, and he's just a huge unit of a man. He was playing, and I mentioned Hamburg and Fremantle, so the Fremantle team is the Fremantle Dockers. This guy was playing in like, an amateur football league in Germany, which is mostly just expat Aussies, but he was playing for the Hamburg Dockers because it's a port city. And they won the German amateur league or something that year. So the whole time we were there, he was on like a non-stop bender. It was amazing. And still, he was on this bender, but he got like an infection in his leg, and then he had a full leg cast and still did this gig where we drove to Denmark. So he was just in the car with a leg like this, and then flew home the next day like an absolute warrior. So friend of the channel, Lee Miller. I hope you're listening, Lee, because
I'm sure he's not, but
he's not.
We'll make sure he does.
It was amazing.
I would like to get back on topic for a second because I do have a couple questions for you.
Back to V30s, boys.
This is probably a real basic question, but like after all of the experimentation, have you found the speaker? Have you found the one, or perhaps the 4 for a 4x12?
Yeah, I'm wondering which speakers to put back in my cabs because I've got all my cabs are gutted right now. None of the speakers are in there. I particularly like the set from 2003 I have, and the ones from 2000. I prefer the 8 ohm speakers to the 16 ohm speakers, so I'm actually considering rewiring changing my 16 ohm cabs to 8 ohm cabs as well, and then eventually get rid of the 16 ohm cabs. But I like the very early ones, my ones from 1986. Despite them being brighter, I like them very much in my orange cab where they live with 2 K100s, so they're definitely going back in there. And I think my front-loaded Engel cab, I think I'm going to put the 2000s and 2003s in that because it just has that metal grate that's pretty open, so you're going to get blasted with those. So I'm going to put the smoother ones in there.
Yep.
And unless the 4 new V30s I bought are also very smooth, then I might put those in there. But I've got a few other things to get to before I investigate that. So they're going to be empty for a while.
Yeah.
What do you when you're just playing guitar for the sheer thrill of playing guitar? What are you using them with? Like, what's the rest of your rig contain at the moment?
I see a Dover amp right behind you. So
yeah, I'm a big Diesel fan. I really
awesome.
love Diesel amps, and I've come to like Engel amps a lot recently as well. So my favorite amp in the world is my Diesel Habit Mark 1. And I'd either use that with my 2 Notes Torpedo Live when it's late in the evening and I don't want to wake everybody. Or sometimes when I have the house to myself, I typically use my front-loaded Zilla cab, which is my absolute favorite. I've got a Fatboy at 212. And other than that...
Zilla.
What's that, sorry?
They do some great videos about cabs and speakers as well. I really like that they have
and there's
a channel.
And they're super nice as well. Paul, who runs that, he's very helpful. Anytime I message him on Facebook when he has his yearly B-stock sale, would you send me that one without the speakers? And usually he's very forthcoming. So
that's cool. I watched a lot of their videos a few months ago when I started going down a bit of a speaker rabbit hole, because their comparisons are very consistent. And as scientific as you can get for this sort of thing. I would love to get a couple of their cabs, but I think shipping them to Australia would be a bit expensive, unfortunately. But that's just you got to deal with it. So yeah. What was I going to say? So you're presumably playing heavier sorts of music. Is that fair? If you're rocking the Diesel and
pretty much, I'm not into the super heavies. Like the heaviest I'd get would be, I don't know, probably Killswitch Engage, that era metalcore, the early In Flames stuff. But I'm a real sucker for 80s music as well. Although that music doesn't come to me as naturally when I play, but like anything from the late 70s up to now that's distorted, that's what I enjoy.
Like you like a bit of George Lynch?
Yeah, sure.
Good. Hey, that's all I need.
Official friend of the podcast.
What and do you like King's X? That's the only other thing I care about.
I don't know. I haven't really listened to King's X. That's not really.
That's something.
That's my homework.
Well, not homework because you just it's a little treat. That's something that just to make the rest of your life better. Just go.
Duly noted.
Yeah, just go.
What would you recommend as a starting point for the yet uninitiated King's X fan, Troy?
I mean, I guess this goes for everybody, but the first 5 albums are like incredible, and there's so many albums too. But just start with Dogman. If you like heavier stuff, Dogman from 1993, 94.
Bit of early Recto. I wonder what speakers Ty was using then. Was he using a Boogie Cab?
Probably. Yeah.
What was in those? I've never even thought about that. I've always just gone, yeah, Lab Systems until Recto.
Yep.
Then whatever.
If you like that Dogman album, then that's awesome, but none of the other albums sound like that. But that one is very, very cool. And then if you know, it just depends on what sort of music listener you are, but you go back and start from the first one and then listen to the first 4 albums after that, and you'll have a good time, I think. Yeah.
Check them out.
Yeah, please do. Please. Because we got to spread the word. That goes for everybody listening to this. If you don't like King's X, just stop listening to us. I don't care about you. Just leave.
I remember your era of so pretty much if you don't like King's X, you shit.
Yep. It's
I was just like, you ask that question to someone, they're like, no, I don't like this. You're like, all right, shuffle off.
You're not worth talking to. Yeah.
I used to try and make my students listen to it at least once a year, but the opportunity doesn't present itself like organically. So, you know, you got to try and ease people in like that, not just like beat them over the head with it. Yeah. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else V30 wise that I had. I feel like I had more questions, but it's not really coming to me at the moment. Yeah, it's just been really awesome to have this chat and like talk about speakers because so speakers to me, they've just become the thing where I'm like not blaming the amp anymore. I'm not blaming the head if I can't get a good guitar sound. I'm blaming the speaker, and it's happened a couple of times. Like I have this KHE switcher, so I've got 8 heads and 4 cabinets that I can select very easily. I've done sessions where, you know, mic a bunch of speakers and I'll have a client sitting right next to me and I just flick through the speakers till they find one they like. And it's been that thing of like, no, don't like it. No, don't like it. Oh, that's the one. It's just amazing.
Yeah. Our amp switch is the greatest tool ever. Like you mentioned it earlier on. Our memory for sounds is so short. Mine's like 3 seconds. That's why I need stuff like amp switchers to switch back and forth in quick succession so that I can actually hear the difference, which is why for my evaluation of the test, I actually got a kind of an A/B plugin so I can switch back and forth between 2 tracks seamlessly to actually hear the difference. Because if I click pause, unmute that track, solo the other one, like in those 3 seconds, I will have forgotten my reference.
Yeah,
I don't know if everybody's like that or
no, everybody's like that.
Stupid.
No, I think it's a human being thing, which is
how humans work.
Yeah, and that's fine. I mean, it's something that needs to be like really discussed. As I said, I think it's not damage, but like the amount of misinformation that's on all of the internet forums. I'm talking about the Gear Spaces. I'm talking about the Gear Pages. All these places. There's like you can't qualify what's good information, bad information, obviously, but there's so much stuff where someone will tell you like it's a speaker. Oh no, this is the worst. The Vintage 30's, never used a Vintage 30. It's the worst speaker. Oh cool. When have you ever played one? Oh no, I've never actually played one before. I've never heard one. It's just,
you know, I read the Gear Page mostly for entertainment nowadays, but like I was never a Gear Space guy. And I remember the 1 or 2 times I tried to use it, especially the guitar subsection. It's just like one very loud person who knows everything on there who wants to just bomb every post with their opinion.
There's 2 very loud people, actually.
When you're just like, hey, who knows what the difference between JCM 800, 2210 and 2203 is? And it's, you know, it immediately deviates from that discussion. Or what IRs are good for my Axe effects? Oh, you don't want to use that. So, yeah, forums are very fickle, aren't they?
Yeah.
You know, with the advent of YouTube where you can watch and listen. And then, you know, someone will be like, hey, you want to listen to 53 different vintage 30 speakers? Listen to this. And someone's like, oh, but YouTube compresses the audio. It's like, well, you don't even know. You don't even know what you're saying when you're saying that. You know, it's like the difference between data compression and audio compression. And
I do have some opinions on that, actually.
You know,
like, yeah, there's a difference audio wise.
Yeah.
It's noticeable. I actually am curious for those of you that do. Well, actually, okay, sorry. As I say the question, I'm realizing how much it is almost irrelevant because the test itself, like really, you want to be able to hear differences more than anything else. Like if it's represented through like, compression or audio compression or whatever, if it sounds different coming out of YouTube, the differences between each speakers is still going to be the same effectively. So I guess it doesn't really matter too much. But yeah, actually that was pretty much the question I was going to ask. If you had listened to the video through the YouTube thing and noticed any differences with, according to like the test you'd made.
Yeah, I've watched my own video. I've listened.
Of course you have, but
I've listened to the differences.
Yeah, was it noticeable?
I can hear them.
Yeah.
This is noticeable to me at least. I'm not sure if it's as noticeable as it was when I was actually recording myself listening to the tracks, but it's noticeable. And even if it wasn't that noticeable, I uploaded everything into a Dropbox folder. It's in the video description. You can download all the reamp tracks. I didn't even use them all for the video because I reamped some cleans as well, but they weren't very helpful for hearing the differences, to me at least. And all the room EQ measurement files, all the graphs, they're there. Everybody can verify what I did. Everybody can make their own analysis with the data I provided. I made the spreadsheet online. Yep. You can look at all the speakers when they were made, what specifically was wrong with them, because unfortunately I ended up with 2 damaged Marshall speakers that kind of out of contention. One of them behaves the same, but it was damaged. The other one had damage in the suspension, which seems to have affected the low end, which I didn't expect. The other one had a hole in the cone, and I thought that would be have more of a drastic effect than repaired suspension damage, but it seemed like the suspension
surprisingly
damage was
not. Worse. Yeah, I've heard that before. So as in like I've heard the speakers with holes in them, and there's a limit to that, but it can be not as big of a deal as you would expect, or repaired and repaired badly, and they can still kind of work okay. It's kind of funny.
Don't leave speakers facing up on the ground and screwdrivers on the cab. That has happened to me.
One of the first ever gigs I did as a assistant audio person, this is back in 2006. There's a speaker, Nexo, the brand's Nexo speakers, and the PS15 model, you could take the horn out and rotate it. So if you were going to use them as front of house speakers, they would sit one way, and if you're going to use them as floor monitors, you'd put them the other way. Like you literally take the grill off and then unscrew the horn and pop it around and screw it back in.
Cool.
And just change the dispersion. And so I was 18 and this was 2006, and the guy I was working with said, grab the PS15 there, take the grill off, turn the speaker around, and then cool, no worries, pop the grill back on. And in the process of doing that, I pulled the grill off and then dropped it into the speaker. And this is about a $6,000 speaker, Australian. So I think made in France. And so, I really shat myself badly, very, very badly. And I was like, do I just lie? Do I just not say anything? But as soon as this guy goes to open the speaker up again, he'll see. So I went and told him, and I said, very, very apologetic. And he said, look, you know what? He's a relatively young guy. He said, look, I understand these things happen. It's not going to affect, not going to be a problem with me hiring you again. It's all okay. He never hired me again. So
well, it's his loss, isn't it, Troy?
Yeah, that's it. And no, I don't do live sound anymore at all. I'm just too busy in the studio doing guitar nerd stuff.
Exactly.
So yeah.
Well, is there anything else, gentlemen, while we're here, or anything else I guess you'd like to comment on that maybe you didn't get to cover on your video, or stuff you've got planned coming up, John?
Well, I'm working on the bonus video for the exotic V30s that I cut out because I was afraid the video was getting too long, like the Hughes and Kettner 1777 cone V30s, the Bad Cat OEMs, the black frame V30s. So that's coming up hopefully next week and or on the weekend. And then I'll be doing some follow-up tests. I'll be doing the dust cap test. I'll be doing a deep dive on the new V30s and doing the break-in test, but obviously that'll take some time. The break-in, one speaker will have to suffer in my garage for a while, so we'll be able to see that. So I'm working at it, and then once I'm done with that, I might try to tackle another mystery like how tubes affect the tone of an amplifier, if they do. Because again, Glenn Fricker and Christian Kohler did videos on that, and they came away with different conclusions. So that's been really occupying my mind for a few years as well, albeit further back than the speakers. I want to find out what's up with that as well.
You know what? I got 2 questions for you, if that's okay, before we leave. First one is like a less well, just a quick throw one. So like, for example, Warehouse has their Veteran 30, which is like a vintage 30 with like the problems fixed. Have you experimented with any of those clones or the other companies' versions of a vintage 30?
I had a Warehouse Retro 30 for a while, which is their other V30 variant, and I liked that a lot. But I sold it eventually to free up funds for more V30s because I wanted to find out how different they sound. But I really want to get into that as well. Like there's a few V30 variants from other manufacturers out there, like the Retro and the Veteran 30 from Warehouse. Then there's, I think, Mojo Tone make the BV30. The Hezu Demon is supposed to be a bit like a vintage 30, so I'm curious about those and I might check them out. But then again, comparing them to a vintage 30 raises the question: which vintage 30?
Yeah.
What do I compare them to? To an early 2000 one? To a current one? That's,
I mean, like,
you have to measure them and say, well, I've got all this data, and that's where it's closest to.
Yeah, I was going to say like the I feel like it was the either the marketing material or just comments that I saw in regards to the Veteran 30, of which I had one for a bit, but I never used it, sold the cab, so that was basically irrelevant. But I did read a post that said something to the effect of, oh, it's like a vintage 30, but with all of the bad stuff not there, like the peaky frequencies or whatever, like any of the stuff that you hate. But I'm just curious because, you know, as we said before, the terminology of like, what's the bad part of a V30? Like, it's not quantifiable. It's like, is that a problem in the 5-6K range? Is it a problem in the 3K range? Like my biggest issue, it's just so fuzzy. So you never know.
And it's something else. And it's something else for different people as well. Like some people really like the early 2000 speakers in my video, while others commented that they didn't like them at all. Like they prefer the more spiky ones, the more harsh sounding ones, some people might say. So it's all subjective as well.
And I guess like the last thing I wanted to just ask, like, I mean, general takeaway, I mean this respectfully and not like as I say this, but does it matter? Like ultimately, if you like the sound of a V30, if you were to pick A to Z of the collection of V30s, do you think you'd be happy just with the sound of a V30, or do you think it's really necessary?
Probably.
Yeah, probably.
I could probably work with any of these speakers. I'd be happy with that.
Yeah.
Like, because in the room, there's so many other factors. Like, what cab is it in?
Yep.
Where are you sitting or standing relative to the speaker? So there's a lot of factors. And for all intents and purposes, they all sound very similar.
Yeah.
Like, I have my preferences on some, but do some of them sound horrible to me? No, they all sound like vintage 30s. And if I only had one set of them or one quad for one cab for the rest of my life, I could live with that.
Yeah, I kind of figured that's what you would say. I mean, it just appears to be a consistent thing. The more you test these things, like there's clearly a thing about a vintage 30, like a sound. It should be plus or minus a tiny bit, like some sort of tolerance of that. And yeah, I'm sure if you like that, or you like your greenback speaker, you're going to maybe prefer one or the other. But ultimately, a vintage 30 is a vintage 30 if it's made in China or made in the UK or made from 1995 or 2023. It doesn't really matter.
I wonder if greenbacks are like that, Troy.
Well, there's a
much more expensive experiment once you get into
I'm not touching that. I'm not touching that at all. I like greenbacks. I have a pair of EVH greenbacks. They're fine. I'm not going.
Those are good ones, apparently. That model.
Yeah, those are nice.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't want to butcher his name, but is it Johan or Johan Segerborn? Like he's got his channel where he does all of he's Swedish, right?
His videos are awesome.
His videos are amazing, but he's the guy. I mean, like he's Mr. Greenback, so he can be Mr. Greenback. You're Mr. Vintage 30, and let's just never the twain shall meet. You know what I mean?
So, Johan's delivery as well, I love so much. Where it's just like, hi.
Hello.
Okay.
Hello. Today. Yes, he's awesome. I love his videos.
15 minutes of just like, he sounds like, to me, he just sounds like Paul Kossoff, like early free. He's just got that thing in his playing where you're like, man, are you just time traveling from the late 60s or like early Clapton? Anytime he plays stuff like that, I'm just like, yeah, that's like that era. It's like a particular thing. And I think for probably people our age, it sounds old-timey, but you know, for people my dad's age, that's like the grail. Like if you can sound like that Blues Breakers era Clapton or free. And he's just got it. Like I hear him play, I'm like, man, this is. I don't just have to listen to those old records. I can listen to like 6 hours of this guy just playing various Marshalls and old speakers, and it's so good.
Like he has this Swedish calmness, this quietness, but still you can tell how enthusiastic he is about the whole thing. Like even just he has like 5 microphones there, and he's going to see how they differ, or what happens if I stuff this cab with pillows and stuff like that. He's just nerding out. He's on his own journey, and he lets us join. I love that. I love his videos.
I mean, you were talking about like the speaker construction. I think there was one video I watched of his where he uses sandpaper on the cone to try and make it thinner and to see what effect that has on the speaker. And it was quite significant. You know, it's like, there's a lot of factors in these things. There's a lot of reasons they sound different, I suppose. So yeah, it's interesting.
Would be cool. It would be very cool to have on. I should try and message him. And I forget if he's Swedish or
I think he's Swedish.
Yeah. And Uge Wellerwerta. I'm not sure if he's
from Finland. Yeah.
He's Finnish, right? He is the JCM 800 overlord to me. Like his amp, like he's got that amp that he calls the bad boy, and it's just like, you know,
you're telling me about him, yeah.
It is the bad boy. Like you just watch him play all this other stuff, and you're like, man, this guy's a great player and like producer. Like everything's awesome. But then he plays this one amp, and it just like everything is just like, man, what happened? Like you play better, and you can see him. He's just like, he's a guy who's like found home in a big way.
He makes that thing sound lethal. It's a killer amp.
Yeah, you know, like I play a 2203, and it sounds like, you know, 70s AC/DC, and he's playing it. It's just this like chonk machine.
It's got a slightly different spec as well. I think it has 6550 tubes, and it has one less filter cap or something like that, because it had the Swedish spec. They were made differently for the Scandinavian market for some reason I've forgotten, and he's got the output transformer changed and something like that. So it's not stock, but
I'll have to watch that.
Yeah, because there is a lot of obviously with like, you know, just where so much guitar-based media comes from is the United States, but you forget. Marshalls are from the UK, so they would have exported heaps of amps to Europe, but it's sort of like stuff like that gets overlooked. I know people talk about like the Canadian JCM 800s as well had slightly different specs because they're, I don't know, whatever it is, slightly different things and different eras. And yeah, that's really fascinating as well, that it's like, well, you're using, you know, the power, the stuff coming out of the wall is different. So you got to design that part of the amp differently. So you inevitably end up with stuff that maybe sounds a little different.
Yeah.
And then you hear these stories from Marshall that when they ran out of one value cab, we'll just use these ones instead. So they just used whatever they had. So there's all this variance there.
Yeah.
It's another tone hunt.
I know. Yeah, I think trying to quantify that variance is, I mean, it's sort of like Paul Reed Smith. Like you listen to him talk about how he got started making guitars, how he was like, you know, I'd play an old Gibson or an old Fender sometimes, and they'd have a thing, and I needed to know what it was. Like I needed to pull these guitars apart and talk to people and figure out the parameters that actually matter. And I say this because I just got a DGT, but like you play that, and I always remember, you know, growing up, people like, oh, PRS is a Fender Gibson hybrid. But then you play one, you're like, yeah, it's sort of got a thing, but like that is the closest thing I've ever tried to like. It can do the like old Les Paul kind of thing. You tap the pickups and the neck kind of sounds like a Strat. The bridge kind of sounds like a Telly. It's got its own thing going on, but it's like they've been able to quantify what makes a couple of different things really appealing to players, and they've actually managed to put it into something that can be consistently manufactured.
I love PRS. I love Paul Reed Smith as well. He's another one of these guys where you can just feel how enthusiastic he is about his product. He just lives and loves what he does. And some people mistake that for, I don't know, him being full of himself. I read in some interviews in the comments, they weren't so kind to him, but I didn't see that at all. I just saw somebody who really loves what they do. And that was the reason why I wanted a PRS, not necessarily because I thought they were the coolest looking or sounding guitars. I just saw how much this guy loved what he did. So I figured I need to check out one of his guitars, and I ended up getting a CE24, which is one of my favorite guitars ever.
Really cool guitars.
I just picked one up, and the neck immediately felt like home. I thought, oh, this is special. I need one of these. So.
Yep, it's crazy. I'll sorry, you go, Troy, because I have one slightly related story to go that I don't know if I've told on the podcast yet.
Oh, well, yeah, I was going to say, like, I mean, I fell in love with PRS guitars because I liked Incubus as my favorite band when I was in high school. And the guitar player was playing a McCarty Hollow Body.
Yep.
So I wanted one for so long, but they're so expensive, and I've never been able to afford one. I've never owned a USA PRS. I've got an SE, which is really, really cool. But one day it's on the list, because I think for the amount of gigs I do, to have a guitar that is that transparent's the wrong word, but like, I guess versatile, because the guitar I'm playing a lot at the moment is a Charvel, which is the opposite of that guitar. It is basically an 80s metal machine, but
aren't the necks awesome?
Oh,
Don't
man.
they feel amazing?
Man, do you know what though? When I first bought the guitar, I think I've told this, but like I put heavy strings on it, and I tuned it down to D standard because that was the band I'm playing in needs to be in that tuning, and it felt awful. Like I loved it in the shop in standard tuning with 10s or 9s even. Putting 11s on it and tuning it down, it felt awful. And it wasn't until I got it set up that I was like, oh my God, this guitar is amazing. And I was playing it today just before we jumped on this, running it through my Synergy head into the V30 cab. And it's just like everything you think of you can do, which is awesome. Like I've got super strats that don't do the same thing. You know, like my RGs aren't quite the same. The strats and tellies I have aren't the same as well, but that guitar just, feels awesome. So anyway, Uncle Leon, what were you going to say?
Oh yeah. So I reckon we should end on this note. I met Paul Reed Smith at the Dallas Guitar Show when I was there.
Yeah, cool.
And Troy would have heard this story before, but for everybody else listening, I was just walking around. It turned out that the day my wife's family are from Dallas, so I was over there for something else. I did some fractal stuff while I was over there, did a few clinics. That was fun. Caught up with the family. Dallas Guitar Show's on like the last day that we're there, the same day as Comic-Con. So Elspeth and I went to Comic-Con. I was there for like maybe 30 minutes with her. She hung out there for the rest of the day. I went to the guitar show. Funnily enough, ran into like two different people who used to come to, they'd always come to ragdoll shows. They just happened to be at Comic-Con. They're like, what are you doing here? And went to the guitar show, was walking around. It was kind of my first experience of like people recognizing me as well, because I was just there and a bunch of people were like, oh, hey man, yeah, I've watched your videos, really, really cool. And I'm looking at some dealer there with their PRS stuff, and there's these two guys playing, and one guy is showing the other guy how to play this riff, and the other guy just keeps kind of like, there's a point in there that he can't quite get, and this guy's got this like visible frustration on his face. I just happened to look over and look at them, and he sort of looked up, and I just like smirked, like, yeah man, I know how it is. Sometimes it's, you're trying to figure out a riff and it just does your head in. So that was me. And I was like, oh, that guy looked really familiar. Anyway, wander off. Oh, how good's this? Eric Johnson's going to be playing. I'm going to go and watch Eric Johnson play. Everybody else says watching Eric Johnson play. I look to the left of me. I'm like, oh, there's that guy from before. Holy shit, it's Paul Reed Smith. And I was like, hey, Paul, I know you get this all day, but man, just love your work. And he goes, hey, you're the guy who was laughing at my bad guitar playing before. I was like, no. What you got to understand is like, I was empathizing with you. And he's like, and he just goes, that's cool. I was like, look, I really love your guitars. I own a few of them. And he just goes, what have you got? I was like, God, this and this. It's like, what's your main guitar? I was like, SC245. How do you like it? Would you change anything about it? Like, you could see him click into that, like, must attain information about manufacturing process. Like, input. Interesting guy. You can see he's just one of those always on people. And I can see how that would come across as like arrogance or aloofness. He's just, everyone I know who's met him is like, oh yeah, that's just Paul.
He lives it.
Yeah. And continues to, like, he doesn't have to.
Yeah.
But he does.
What he loves.
Yeah. I really admire that. And on that note, I have to say thank you for joining us on the podcast, John. Where can people find you on the World Wide Web?
They can just type in the other John Browne in YouTube, and with a bit of luck, they might even find me. I'm not the guy from Monuments, obviously. So that's my name. So I chose that title for it. So
do you know what's funny? I thought you were talking about the John Browne that designed the 5150.
It's James Browne.
Oh, it's James Browne. Shit, you're right.
But not James Browne.
But not that James Browne, the other James Browne.
Yeah.
Too many Browns in this gear space. Yeah.
That's so funny. Well,
it's hey, JB is also the initials of a humbucker. So there you go.
Yeah, the Jason Becker model.
Yeah.
Oh dear.
Dear is the word for it. Now, thanks for coming on, mate. It was a pleasure, and I cannot wait to see what you've got planned on the channel. I'll definitely be tuning in, and I would encourage everybody listening to go and find the channel, subscribe, and send John some love.
Absolutely. Awesome, man.
Thanks very much, guys. I appreciate that. I had a blast. Thanks.
Peace.
Awesome, mate. Well, to everybody else on the World Wide Web, which is, as I discovered earlier this week, is quicker to say than www. We'll see you next week. Hey, everybody. Thank you very much.
Peace.
Goals.